ever heard of the phrase, the black sheep of the family? Well, even some of our favorite horror franchises out there features a game that most fans would agree are the black sheep of their respective series. In fact, some of the games unfortunately ruined the perfect horror game trilogy, a title that's not easily achieved with video game franchises. So on today's episode of Nerdspace Games, we'll be shining a light on those very games that ruined the perfect opportunity of claiming the title of a perfect trilogy. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and here are 10 horror games that ruined the perfect trilogy. Let's get it. Number 10, Zero Time Dilemma, Zero Escape series. While the Zero Escape series might not be classified as a true horror trilogy, the themes and gory elements of the franchise somewhat resembles the Saw movies to a certain extent. So, if Saw is horror, I'd argue that Zero Escape series is also horror as well. Essentially, in every game of the trilogy, participants are gathered and thrown into a killing game similar to that of the Danganronpa series. The object of the game is to escape the facility, however, in order to do that, the player will need to learn who they can trust and who they can't trust. It gets a lot deeper than that, but that's pretty much the basic premise of the entire trilogy. Anyway, while the first two games of the series are masterpieces, and I highly recommend that you play them, the third and final game of the series is kind of a letdown. This game was supposed to be the grand finale, as it brought characters from the two previous games together and challenged them to face the crisis that the games have been building up towards to this point. Unfortunately, there's just so much wrong with this game, which ultimately robbed us of a great finale. The decision to move from the visual novel style to a new 3D animation style just didn't work for me. The extra killer game that the players found themselves compared to the previous two Notary games was pretty lackluster, and the direction for different returning characters ultimately just didn't make sense for me. There were a few positives, like one of the new protagonists of the game, Carlos, and jumping back and forth between different timelines was smoother and more connected to the story compared to the previous entries of the series. But ultimately, none of this was able to save Zero Time Dilemma from being the weakest entry of the Zero Escape series and failing as the grand finale that us fans have been dying to experience since 999. Number 9, Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, Amnesia. One thing that most horror fans can agree on is that the first and last entry of the Amnesia series were fantastic horror games for different reasons. However, the second and third entries of the series are a little more polarizing, especially the third entry of the series, Amnesia Rebirth. With that being said, I actually love Amnesia Rebirth. Sure, it's not as great as The Dark Descent or The Bunker, but still manages to have one of the better stories of the series, and it's actually pretty terrifying, especially when exploring the tunnels deep underground. The same can't be said about Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs though. Perhaps it's because this was the only Amnesia game to not be developed by Frictional Games, but A Machine for Pigs just fails in every single department when comparing it to its predecessor and its sequel. For one, unlike every other game of the series, you can't die. Instead, when you are captured by one of the man-pigs, you get locked away nearby and you get to try and escape from them again. It's honestly kind of lame even for a walking simulator. Speaking of which, the man-pigs of A Machine for Pigs are easily the least scariest enemies of the entire Amnesia series. You have the Gatherers in The Dark Descent, the Harvesters in Rebirth, and the infamous Bees in The Bunker. All of these enemies are leaps and bounds scarier than that of the man-pigs. The atmosphere of A Machine for Pigs is also pretty lackluster and pales in comparison to every other location of the Amnesia series. And while the story is a little interesting, it's easily the most predictable ending and story throughout the entire series, and therefore the story eventually falls flat by the time the credits roll. All in all, A Machine for Pigs was a massive disappointment, and it pretty much ruined the Amnesia trilogy. Number 8, Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil Remake Trilogy. So I'm kind of cheating here, but I'm looking at the Resident Evil Remake Trilogy for this next entry. This of course includes 2019's Resident Evil 2, 2020's Resident Evil 3, and 2023's Resident Evil 4. Now listen, I am one of the biggest defenders of RE3 Remake. Yeah, I know the game isn't the greatest and that it's a bad remake, but all in all, it's still a fun game, and there are some things I really do appreciate about it. However, even I have to draw the line somewhere. If you take Resident Evil 3 Remake and compare it to the RE2 and RE4 remakes, then clearly Resident Evil 3 Remake is the odd one out. Unlike those games, Resident Evil 3 Remake cut a ton of content, didn't add anything new, and somehow ended up being shorter than the original game. Plus, one of the best parts of the original game, Nemesis, was far less intimidating and a pretty shitty stalker enemy. In fact, Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 Remake was one of my least favorite stalker enemies of the entire franchise, which is crazy considering the original Nemesis is my second favorite stalker behind Mr. X of RE2 Remake. With RE2 Remake being a satisfying remake and RE4 Remake being one of the most fun games of the franchise, courtesy of the very addicting gameplay mechanics, Resident Evil 3 Remake just misses the mark completely, and for that reason, it ruins Capcom's shot at delivering a perfect trilogy with the remakes of Resident Evil. Number 7, Clock Tower 2, The Struggle Within. Okay, so honestly speaking, this is a weird one to talk about. Technically speaking, Clock Tower 2, The Struggle Within, aka Ghost Head, was the third installment of the franchise. However, if we're looking at numbered entries to form the quote-unquote trilogy, then I think we should consider the original Clock Tower game, this game, Clock Tower 2, The Struggle Within, and Clock Tower 3. So, looking at these three games, none of them are perfect, which is why this one kind of pops up early on today's list, as it is the farthest from ruining the perfect trilogy, but it does ruin a good trilogy in my opinion. That's because the first Clock Tower is a masterpiece in survival horror, even for a point-and-click game. Scissors Man is one of the most iconic and scariest stalker enemies seen in a horror game, and while the gameplay is definitely outdated, it's still a lot of fun to play today, especially since you have the rewind version available now on modern consoles. And the third game is surprisingly a lot of fun too. That game changes the gameplay experience and moves away from the point and click mechanics. The enemies and set design of Clock Tower 3 are brilliant as well, and a lot of the things that happen in that game set the stage for the spiritual successor to Clock Tower, Haunting Ground. With that being said, there's absolutely nothing good I can say about the second game of the series, Clock Tower 2, The Struggle Within. The point and click mechanics are still here, but began feeling a little outdated for its time. Scissors Man was nowhere to be seen, which had become a staple of the franchise, with different variations of Scissors Man appearing in most games of the series outside of this one. And the gameplay mechanics and the whole Mr. Bates thing just didn't work for me in the slightest, and the game became a massive chore to play through, especially since it lacked any of the horror vibes and creepy environments as seen in the original game. Number 6, Alone in the Dark 2. The Alone in the Dark trilogy was actually not all bad, even with the inclusion of Alone in the Dark 2. In fact, I would say that some might argue it's one of the better horror game trilogies out there. Still, the main issue comes from the title of Perfect Trilogy, and there were too many things that the second Alone in the Dark game did wrong that ultimately ruined its chances at being a perfect trilogy. For one, the story was subpar compared to the other two games, which were already rough to begin with. And the setting of Alone in the Dark 2 was far less interesting than that of Disorder Manor of the first game and Slaughtertown of the third game. However, the biggest crime of Alone in the Dark 2 is the fact that it moved away from the horror elements that made the first game such a masterpiece. Resident Evil took a lot of inspiration from Alone in the Dark when developing a survival horror game that would put survival horror on the map. Unfortunately, Alone in the Dark 2 forgot about all of those iconic features and delivered a subpar action game versus the survival horror game that we all fell in love with. Thankfully, the third game went back to its horror roots, but because of the departure from horror in the second game, the trilogy missed out on becoming a perfect trilogy. Number 5, Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil Action Horror Trilogy. In 2005, Capcom took the Resident Evil franchise in a completely different direction with Resident Evil 4, in which it would lean more towards action horror versus the traditional survival horror genre that the series was built upon. And while Resident Evil 4 would go down as one of the most successful horror games of all time, it would also pave the road for Capcom to go down a dark path in which they would strip away all horror elements and abandon their roots completely. This ultimately created what is known as the action horror trilogy of Resident Evil. And while RE4 was a clear masterpiece, and for some people, Resident Evil 5 might also be their favorite game of the series despite it leaning more towards action, Resident Evil 6 is to this day regarded as one of the worst mainline entries of the series. Now listen, I know there are some people that love this game. Hell, I've seen the comments on previous videos of mine in which fans of RE6 would passionately defend this game through thick and thin. And I respect that. Despite that though, I'm sure those same fans can agree that RE6 in comparison to RE4 and RE5 is a complete downgrade. The main problem with Resident Evil 6 is that it tried to appease as many fans as possible by creating multiple campaigns featuring multiple returning characters, but unfortunately it just didn't work, it didn't mesh well. And while Resident Evil 5 abandoned the franchise's horror roots already, RE6 did so in a much bigger way, to the point where some parts of the game literally felt like a third-person Call of Duty game, and in other instances, it felt like I was playing some sort of Bruce Lee game. The boss fights are also pretty lackluster in comparison to previous games. The environments are pretty bland and boring despite the characters traveling all over the world. And the story just didn't click with me at all. Sure, there are a few shiny moments in the game, like the Mercenaries mode, which is one of the best versions of Mercenaries today. Leon's campaign was also pretty decent since it at least tried to include some horror elements. And Pierce Nivens is the true star of Resident Evil 6 and was without a doubt one of the better parts of the entire game. Still, all of these positives are not enough to make up for the fact that Resident Evil 6 is without a doubt the worst of the action horror trilogy of Resident Evil. Number 4, Dead Space 3. A common trend that you'll notice on today's video is how much of the games that ruined their respective horror trilogies did so by moving away from their horror roots and focusing on action gameplay instead. In fact, that issue is present in more than half of the games on today's list, including Dead Space 3. Listen, I'm not gonna say Dead Space 3 was a bad game because I don't think it was. It was actually kind of fun at some points. My problem with this game breaks down into 3 parts. 1, the story was by far the worst of the trilogy. Dead Space moved away from the hallucinations seen in the previous 2 entries, which ultimately added a tense experience because you never knew what was real and what wasn't. 2, as I already said, the horror was out the door for this entry in favor of action combat. In fact, every horror element seen in the first 2 installments of the series were completely gone. Dismembering limbs didn't feel like a requirement anymore to kill necromorphs like it did in previous games. The atmospheres of this game just didn't come close at all to the terrifying atmospheric horror experience seen in the first 2 games. And even the enemy designs of Dead Space 3 were just far less interesting and terrifying compared to the first 2 games. In fact, I would argue that the Awakened DLC for Dead Space 3 was a better Dead Space game than the actual main game itself, which is kind of embarrassing. And finally, don't get me started on the fact that this game was one of EA's earliest attempts at microtransactions. Yeah, fuck that shit. Number 3, F.E.A.R 3. To be honest with you guys, this might be one of the more controversial opinions here, considering that there is actually a pretty devoted fanbase to the 3rd installment of F.E.A.R. In fact, there's some people out there that would actually argue that F.E.A.R 3 is better than F.E.A.R 2, which I am definitely not one of those people. F.E.A.R 2 is still, to this day, my favorite of the franchise because of the horror atmosphere in the game. And even the first game does a phenomenal job with the atmospheric horror, mainly due to Alma's hallucinations. Unfortunately, the 3rd game moves far away from horror elements, adds co-op, and basically turns it into another generic first-person shooter game. If I wanted a first-person shooter with some horror vibes to it, I'd play Doom. Don't get me wrong, F.E.A.R 3 is clearly the best when it comes to gameplay, but as a horror fan and someone that absolutely adores the first 2 games of the series, F.E.A.R 3 goes in a completely different direction to the point where I just hate what it did for the series. Had this game at least focused on the horror elements seen in the first 2 installments of the series, then the F.E.A.R trilogy could have been one of those perfect horror game trilogies. Unfortunately, F.E.A.R 3, at least in my opinion, fucks that up completely. Number 2, Dino Crisis 3. As with most of this list, 2 of the entries in this trilogy are masterpieces. The first Dino Crisis is one of my favorite survival horror games on the original PlayStation, and even the second game, even though it moves towards action horror, is a lot of fun. Both games are highly praised by fans and critics alike. Unfortunately, Dino Crisis 3 is a game that most fans of the series tries to pretend it never existed. I mean, on paper, a dinosaur horror game should work. Dinosaurs are equally as terrifying as they are awesome. Sadly, for one reason or another, developers suck at making good dinosaur horror games. As of today, the only 2 good dinosaur horror games are the first 2 Dino Crisis games. And you would think Dino Crisis 3 would be able to deliver on that too, but it just fails in every possible area. The gameplay side of things are complete garbage, which is ironic considering that this game is developed for a newer console. Also, the minds behind this game must have been 5-year-olds because they somehow thought, oh, how could we make Dino Crisis 3 better than the original 2 games? Oh, I know. How about we make them zombie dinosaurs and put them in space? I'm sorry, that sounds like a toddler came up with that idea, and that mindset would unfortunately carry over to every aspect of this game, from the story to the gameplay to the dinosaur designs to the atmosphere itself. Everything about this game felt like it was developed by kids, and it's a damn shame because the first 2 installments of this series were absolute masterpieces. Sadly, Dino Crisis 3 pretty much killed the series, and to this day, fans are still hoping we get a remake for the first game in the hopes that we could see the series brought back from extinction. Number 1, the 3rd birthday, Parasite Eve. As a major fan of Parasite Eve and Parasite Eve 2, I'm sure you can imagine how painful it is for me to put the 3rd entry of this series, the 3rd birthday, on this list as a game that ruined the perfect trilogy. Like seriously, Parasite Eve 1 and 2 are both masterpieces, each shining for different reasons. The first game had one of the most exciting and interesting stories seen in a horror game, complete with RPG mechanics, and the second game found the perfect sweet spot between survival horror and RPG. Unfortunately, the third birthday ruined all chances of making this trilogy a perfect one. The first issue is the fact that a third birthday had to move away from anything and everything that connected it to the novel that Parasite Eve was based on of the same name. The reason being because the author of the novel was not satisfied at all with the direction of the first two games and did not agree to renew the rights of the IP for Square to use in the third game. This is why anything that was mentioned in the book, including the lack of the name Parasite Eve in the title of the third installment, is completely ignored in this game, which ultimately feels like it only loosely connects to the story, mainly because of some of the returning characters. However, the big issues with the game comes from the gameplay side of things. First off, the game no longer felt like a survival horror RPG hybrid, but rather a third-person shooter, and a crappy one at that. On top of that, all horror elements were taken out in favor of action gameplay. And finally, the enemy types had to be changed due to copyright issues since they couldn't renew the IP, which led to less interesting and more generic enemy designs that didn't even come close to the horrors that we saw in the first two games. There's plenty of other problems as well, like how this game primarily plays with time traveling elements, but for the sake of time, just know this game was a massive step down in comparison to the first two games of this iconic series. But that does it for this episode of Nerdspace Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Do you agree with me about each of these horror games ruining the perfect horror game trilogy, or do you think any of the games on today's list doesn't deserve to be here? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.